Good morning, Lenore.
Morning, Bridie.
Good morning, Mike.
Hey, Bridie.
Welcome to the end of the campaign.
Are we there yet?
Almost. If you don't ask that question too much, then it will go quicker.
Okay. That's what you tell your kids, right?
Exactly. There seems to be a general consensus that Albanese has had a good campaign and Dutton has had a bad one. But is that actually true?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is true. I think Dutton is kind of inherently the better communicator. He can deliver a message better. He can be more on message, and we saw that so clearly in the Voice campaign and kind of through the whole last term of government when he was kind of relentlessly on message about cost of living. But I think the problem with the campaign was he didn't really have a coherent message. It wasn't clear precisely and clearly what he was trying to say. Sometimes he seemed to be sort of going a bit down the Trump route of talking about cutting public servants and woke identities and that sort of thing. And then he'd veer back away from it. Then at the end of the campaign, he jumped back onto the Welcome to Country issue. Sometimes he seemed to be against spending. Then he'd announce big spending policies. He wasn't, he was against Labor's tax cut on budget night, but then he had a tax rebate of his own. So I think his campaign was let down a bit by his performance, but a lot by the absence of a very coherent and disciplined strategy, whereas Anthony Albanese was on message about the cost of living the whole way through. And even though he doesn't always deliver a message particularly eloquently, he stuck to the script. Bad for us sometimes in trying to get a story, but he stuck to the script. And he kind of grew in confidence as the campaign went on, and it went well for him. And I think the opposite could be said for Peter Dutton.
I remember talking about this after the Voice campaign or during the Voice campaign about how it might be easier to sell that kind of message in a yes or no vote situation, the referendum, than in a multi-policy environment of a federal election where you have to talk about lots of different things. You're trying to sell a positive message as well as a negative one about
and
your
knit
opponent.
it together somehow into a story.
A coherent narrative. And we said at that time that might be more difficult than what he's just done in the Voice campaign, and I think that has very much proven to be the case. It wasn't enough to try to drag Albanese down. That's obviously part of it, but with the economic conditions sort of the first signs of them starting to improve, interest rates looking like they're coming down, inflation's coming down, it's possible for the Labor to tell a story about how they're on the road to recovery. That wasn't enough for Dutton to just harp on about cost of living without having something to offer to say, and this is what we're going to do about it.
And that was part of it too, that a lot of people on his own side of politics are saying is, why did they leave? The policies that they did have, they left till quite late in the campaign. Some of the policies they announced at the beginning of the campaign, they didn't seem to talk about much late in the campaign. Some of those ones they announced before the campaign, like the sort of tax write-offs for lunches for small businesses, you kind of never heard of again. So what he was delivering was late and not coherent as well.
What do you think have been the high points and low points of this campaign?
Yes, the high points of the campaign. so many to recount.
I'm so glad you got that question right.
Look, for me, I think Bob Katter's Easter message was probably the high point of the campaign, where he went on one of his characteristic riffs, this time about Coles and Woolworths and Jesus bashing the living daylights out of money changers in the temple. Not quite sure if he was quoting literally from the Bible there. Anyway, that was.
It cuts through though. Multiple people sent that to me. Like outside of journalism and media and politics, that's what got sent to me the most in this campaign.
Lots of people enjoyed that. I mean, I guess usually in a campaign, I think when something becomes newsworthy, that generally means it's probably going to be a low point for someone rather than a high point because it's a mistake or it's something amusing or, you're getting an unfortunate photograph or something. And there have been quite a few of those. Peter Dutton's bus getting stuck on the median strip in the middle of Sydney.
It's like the reject shot metaphor. You just want to avoid those.
And other buses literally crashing into a pre-poll centre.
That was bad.
Dutton hitting the cameraman on the head with a football,
also bad.
Unlucky,
actually not a bad
not
throw.
Great. For Anthony Albanese falling off the stage, which he was asked what was the worst moment on the campaign. He said falling off the stage. Then he went on to deny
That
he'd
was
fallen off
weird.
the stage.
I don't know why he let that be an issue. He fell off the stage,
Yeah.
right?
He definitely did.
It was an issue of his own making because he denied it, what was on video.
I think a lot of people would say the debates were another low point. I particularly found the music in the Channel 7 debate a real low point.
Wow, you're getting specific here, Mike.
That sort of the wind-up music to tell them
Yeah.
they didn't have much time left. Very off-putting. I think, to be a bit more serious, I think the actual real low point of the campaign was when Peter Dutton called the ABC and Guardian the hate media. I think that was not just a Trump-esque moment, but a sort of kind of quite, maybe sinister is going a little bit too far, but like a really unpleasant insight into how he was trying to pitch the campaign to some people. That's the kind of, demonising of the, frankly, we hope, objective and very sensible
and
not sensationalist media was quite disturbing, and whether he regretted saying it or not afterwards, or he was quite happy to
he
say it to
doubled
that
down on
audience. Yeah, he did. I thought that was the actual genuinely low point of the campaign.
And you do reference it being Trump-esque. He did make a big effort to distance himself from Trump throughout this campaign. But what have we learned about the claimed associations between the Liberal Party and Trump's team?
So you're right. Peter Dutton seemed at the beginning of the campaign that he was sort of going a bit down the Trump playbook. I mean, remember he announced Jacinda Nampijinpa-Price as his second shadow minister for government waste, which I always found kind of funny. Anyway, but then he kind of veered back away from that and was running a more positive campaign, and then sort of went back and forth a bit at the end. But Guardian Australia's written a story on Thursday, which is based on reporting that was done by these two Europe-based organisations, a German organisation called Correctiv and the Centre for Climate Reporting in the UK, who did an undercover investigation, which was basically looking at the extent to which sort of mugger-style politics was being pushed around the world. As part of that, they did a secret recording of an interview with the co-chair of President Trump's 2024 campaign, a man called Chris Lasavita. And in that interview, kind of apropos of nothing, sort of it was an aside, it was not the point of the interview, Lasavita said, on April 16, I was in Australia 2 weeks ago helping the Liberal Party there on some of their structural issues that they were having with Peter Dutton. So we found out about this, saw that they had reported it, went to the Liberal Party, who say quite clearly that Mr. Lasavita is not advising the campaign. And Mr. Lasavita is saying he does not work for the Liberal Party of Australia. Mr. Lasavita does say that he works for a wide variety of business interests, some of them in Australia. So nobody's saying he wasn't here, and there's a lack of clarity about exactly what he was doing here. But I think it is very interesting that he is claiming to have been here advising someone associated with the Liberal Party. I think that's quite significant and interesting.
It really is. And Lenore, you wrote an editorial on the site this week. In it, you wrote, a minority Labor government could be truly progressive. How did Guardian Australia come to this view?
Like writing an editorial needs to be a careful exercise. Like we need to assess the party's policies against our values and what we think are important, what we think is important for Australia. And I think in this campaign there was quite a lot to weigh up. As I said in the editorial, Anthony Albanese came to office in 2022 promising steady, careful government. Like he was very clear, I'm not going to do outrageous, quick, shocking things. I'm going to be steady and gradual and take the people with him, and to be focused on working families. Now, I think, judged by what he said he would do, he can legitimately claim to have delivered on some of that. But at the same time, there are a lot of progressive voters who might wish that he'd gone a lot further, been a bit less careful, a bit less gradual. He isn't promising to increase job seeker, even though that is the thing that you could do to help the people hurt most by cost of living. He hasn't done an EPA, which he said he would do because of the influence of the West Australian Labor Party. He hasn't advanced any kind of vision really about what happens post-Voice. So there's a whole lot of places where, from a progressive point of view, people might wished he'd done more and gone faster. So I think that leaves progressive voters with a choice, both in some electorates where there are Teals or Greens or progressive independents, and also in the Senate. You know, they can vote for those minor parties in the hopes that there's a minority Labor government, you know, from those progressive voters' point of view, that there's a minority Labor government and that crossbench pushes them further towards what those voters might want to happen. But there's a risk in that, right? Because when you cast your individual vote in your individual seat, you don't know what the makeup of the parliament is. If too many people do that, you know, you could end up with a minority coalition government, which those voters would not want. So I think what we ended up saying in the editorial was progressive voters need to be strategic and think about it. There are, in a world of uncertainty, which all this stuff is happening around the world, and we've been focusing on sort of quite small cost of living things. But in that environment, there is an argument that you want certainty, that you want, you know, a clarity of government. On the other hand, you could argue that part of the populism that is sort of rocking the world is because governments didn't do enough about inequality, didn't do enough about social issues. So I think where we landed was progressive voters have strategic choices to make.
And why do news outlets write editorials at the end of campaigns?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure they actually sway all that many votes, to be perfectly frank. I think most people make up their own minds. I think the important thing to do about them, though, is to be really coherent in your arguments and coherent in how you're lining up what you're saying with the values that you have as a news organisation. You know, we saw that went quite wrong for many news organisations at the end of the 2024 US election, like the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos decided they wouldn't endorse anyone, and a lot of staff and people saw that as kind of capitulating or being concerned about the possibility of President Trump and what he might do. You know, the Guardian's 2024 election editorial in the US began, "It is hard to imagine a worse candidate for the American presidency in 2024 than Donald J. Trump." I mean, I think we can stand by that.
I think often those endorsements tell you more about the news organisation than they do about the politicians or the parties. I think it's easier. It's a little easier for us in a slightly more fragmented political spectrum to say there is a bit of a range of choices for progressive voters, and depending on what seat you're in, you might have a variety of options about who to vote for. Here are the issues that we think matter and that you might want to take into account.
I want to talk a little bit about the coverage of this campaign. What do you think the impact of media scrutiny has been in the past months?
I think before the campaign, Peter Dutton was sort of justifiably criticised for mostly just doing interviews with friendly media that, you know, sort of largely supported him. And there's been a widespread view that that didn't prepare him well for a campaign where he's getting a press conference every day with the full force of the press gallery asking him questions. That certainly made a difference, but I think a lot of the problems of his campaign, they were kind of all his own work, really.
Yeah, I think when you have at least two occasions in the campaign where he's had to front up and say, I made a mistake, one on policy and one on the kind of the Indonesian president issue. That clip of him saying, I made a mistake, is, regardless of what the subject matter was, always going to look terrible. To a large extent, he couldn't avoid the scrutiny of the media on those issues.
But I guess part of what I'm saying is that a lot of the things that looked bad for the coalition were when what he said didn't match what a shadow minister said, when what he said one day about a policy was different from what he said the next day. And yes, I think the media did a pretty good job this campaign of scrutinising both leaders, but a lot of his problems were kind of entirely of his own making.
Yeah.
Lenore, you wrote this week that predictions are for pollsters or mugs. I hope we're neither of those on this podcast. So I'm not asking for predictions here, but I would like to ask, what should eagle-eyed viewers be looking for tomorrow night on election night as the results come in?
I mean, I think that there is going to be very varied results depending on the seats and the types of seats. So, you know, we all can see what the nationwide polls are saying, but I'll be really interested to look the extent to which it looks different in those outer suburban seats where cost of living is biting the hardest, where Peter Dutton's messaging might be resonating the best, where they've done the preference deals with Pauline Hanson, which may, push the Liberal Party candidates, further into contention or mean that they win some of those seats. I'll be really interested in watching that. I'm very interested to watch what happens in those 3 Green seats in Brisbane and the Teal seats, because I think one of the things in this campaign has been the incredibly well-funded and ferocious third-party attacks on Greens and Teals. The advertising and anti-Greens messaging in Brisbane is really very, very, very hard to miss. And there's been a lot of attacks on the Teals as well. And the Teals have, made some missteps. So it'll be interesting to see the extent to which that has an impact. So, yeah, they're the things I'll be looking for.
Yeah, I think other than the pure headline figure of who forms government and what the national vote share is, I think the narrative I'm really interested in is this historic decline of the 2 major parties and whether that continues, and if so, where that vote goes among minor parties, among independents on the right as well as the left, and what impact that has on the makeup of the next parliament. I think that's the long-term trend that is the most interesting, and the more, if it carries on, if it keeps accelerating the way it did at the last election, then that is going to produce a really, really different kind of parliament from the ones we've been used to in the past.
Lenore and Mike, you are going to be back with listeners very soon. You are both on the Full Story Election Night podcast tomorrow night.
Can't wait.
I can't wait to hear your searing insights.
It's going to be great. Wait, you're not going to be there?
I'll be there as moral support, but you will have a different host. Now it's time for what we can't get out of our head. And it absolutely cannot be about the election.
It's not, promise it's not.
Lenore, what is it for you?
So for me, it is this whole kind of weird argument between the woman who runs Recipe Tin Eats and someone called Brookie Bakehouse, who I'm sure I was supposed to have heard of but hadn't heard of, and whether Brookie Bakehouse plagiarised recipes from Nagi, who runs Recipe Tin Eats. Now, I'm a long, long way outside my area of expertise here, but what I'm really interested to understand is how intellectual property applies to recipes, like how different a caramel slice recipe can be. I'm not saying it can't, I just don't really get it. I usually just Google a recipe and pick the one that's easiest and quickest to make. So, I don't know, but we are endeavouring to find out because I think it's really interesting.
I usually Google a recipe and then pick the Recipe Tin Eats one that comes up because they almost never fail. Mike, what was it for you? What can't you get out of your head?
My story this week is just a completely policy-free one from one of our UK contributors, Tim Dowling, about the day he went to a dog agility trial and had a go going around it with a dog. And it's very funny. It's got lovely pictures of dogs. It's got some great quotes about dogs. And if you just want some,
good dog content.
Good dog content, there it is. No, it means no more than that.
Because we're all in withdrawals after Valerie.
I can always rely on you to surface something on the site that I haven't seen, Mike. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and see you again tomorrow night.
Yep. Thanks, Bridie.
Thanks, Bridie.
Lenore.